Welcome back to the Horror Academic, and this show is all about movies that I love, and a movie that I have loved for a really long time is Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. Now, last time we talked about Halloween Kills, so I've been on a bit of a Halloween rewatch. On Halloween, I went and saw Halloween Ends in the theater, but that made me think about Halloween 3, so I broke this one out, and we also watched this one that night. And I've loved this movie for a long time, and unlike perhaps fans when it came out, what I liked about it wasn't a traditional sequel. It wasn't more of Michael Myers running around with a knife. So, I think this is an important one for us to talk about today. Okay, so this movie came out in 1982. 40 years ago, this movie came out. And unfortunately, I think it only really started to get the love it deserves in the past 5 to 10 years. Part of the problem, obviously, so when this movie comes out in 1982, a lot of people are not fans right off the bat because there's no Michael Myers, right? There's no Jamie Lee Curtis. There's no Haddonfield. All of it's completely a start over, right? It's a standalone story. And this surprised people. This surprised audiences. This surprised some of the people behind the scenes, like the producers. But I think this is kind of classic now that most people know. The intent of Carpenter and Hill, director John Carpenter and producer Deborah Hill, was that Halloween should go on to become an anthology series. You didn't have to keep cranking out more stories about Michael Myers, because let's just use this as an opportunity to say, hey, every year around Halloween, let's put out a movie that takes place on Halloween night. So they call up Tommy Lee Wallace, who was the editor and I believe production designer on the original Halloween, who passed on working on Halloween 2 because he was like, this looks like the same thing. Wasn't interested. But Deborah Hill reached out to him and said, hey, we're thinking of doing Halloween 3, but don't worry, it's going to be a totally new story. So he's interested, and he comes on board. He is picked as the director for the project. The film goes through a couple of writing layers. There's actually a really good article in the October 2022 issue of Fangoria that discusses kind of the anniversary of this movie and kind of the behind the scenes on the writing. The person originally hired to write the film was Nigel Kneale, who was, a big deal for genre fans in the UK because he was behind the Quatermass television series and movies. But he had really bad experiences trying to come over to the States and work in Hollywood, and he was not crazy about the experience on this film as well, I believe, because he submits his screenplay and John Carpenter does a rewrite. And then Tommy Lee Wallace gets the script, sees John Carpenter's rewrites, and he was kind of like, no, I think we can make that better. So he does a layer of rewrites. So I think this is why initially when you look at the film, it's listed as written and directed by Tommy Lee Wallace. I don't know if Carpenter definitely, as a producer and someone who's kind of stepping back in his role on this film from the first, is kind of saying, no, you don't need to credit me as a producer. That's part of my job, right? Making sure we have a good screenplay. And I think this is why Nigel Kneale is kind of also not interested in having his name on the product by this time, because it got so rewritten in his eyes that it's like, all right, well, I don't really care for this to have my name on it again. Not quite like Alan Smithy levels of rewrites here, or demanding names to be taken off, but I think for years there was a kind of a misnomer that it was just written by Tommy Lee Wallace, but no, it did go through those stages. Sidebar, Alan Smithy, if you don't know what it is, Alan Smithy is a name that people can choose if they're, I think only if you're in the guilds, like the Directors Guild, the Producers Guild, the Writers Guild, all that. I think at that point you can choose if a film has gone so far astray from your involvement in it that you don't want your name on it anymore. There's some pretty classic cases of directors being so mad about a producer changing a film so much, or the editor having Final Cut versus, that kind of stuff. When it gets into that realm of, this isn't my movie anymore, I don't want my name on it, take my name off. The tradition for a while there was just slap the name Alan Smithee, which made it seem like there was some guy named Alan Smithee who made a ton of movies at one point, but not really true. So just so you understand that reference. So this is why when we get started here, we're looking at a film that has nothing to do with what this franchise, which wasn't really like, franchises back in the early 80s weren't as strict with rules as we are about them today, I guess. Kind of like still a new concept of having more than a few films that had to have harsh continuity or anything like that. I mean, you think about what franchises were in the 70s, when you have like Godzilla movies, like those aren't particularly linear in storytelling, right? Yeah, when you get to like science fiction stuff, they're usually like offshoots of other kind of mediums, like, yeah, they're Star Trek movies, but okay, that's really like, watch the show so you understand what's going on, right? Really the first instance, and I've talked about this in the past, of like full on what we consider franchising really goes like to Planet of the Apes to me. And of course Star Wars takes that over, and branding becomes more important than anything. But I think we didn't have as strict binary rules, particularly in horror, for what a franchise had to be, right? When Halloween 3 comes about, it's this kind of people who had worked in and around the first two films kind of deciding to make another film. It's really where we're at, So what is Halloween 3 then? Tom Atkins is a doctor who is working late one night when someone comes in who has been, something obviously violent has happened to him, and he dies while he's there, and he's clutching a Halloween mask, which kind of gets him rolling. Like, I don't understand what's going on here, and this doesn't make sense, there's something wrong. And so he kind of gets trapped in the mystery of who is this guy who just died here, By going to the funeral, he meets the man's daughter, who is also very much in this very kind of sleuthish mode of figuring out, how did my father get murdered, which leads to the two of them kind of working together to find out more and track down the origins of what led to the man's demise. So it has a little bit of a, like the second half of Psycho, it has that kind of feel where we have two people who just met being kind of thrown together, working together and kind of pretending to be a married couple to kind of infiltrate and find out what's going on. So personally, I see a very strong influence in that mode of storytelling from Psycho. Obviously, there's also, because what's going on is that it turns out that these masks are being used by this, evil corporation to essentially attack the children of America. And what it does to them is kind of fries them up. So it's got a bit more of like a, between this kind of con to get all the kids in the country to want the mask so that they're all wearing the mask when the movie for Halloween night plays and the song plays on television, and they're all rushed to go home in time to see the movie. So you add that element of kind of putting the children in distress, pairing it with this kind of automaton people that are working for this kind of evil corporation, and you have a very Invasion of the Body Snatchers influenced story as well. So Season of the Witch is also, why it's called Season of the Witch, is taking a lot from the fact that it is playing with the origins of the Halloween tradition of Samhain. And in this, we're talking about druids, we're talking about Stonehenge. This is kind of taking advantage of the, I guess, like late 70s, early 80s fascination with unsolved mysteries, right? I remember growing up in the age of, UFO sightings and the Bermuda Triangle and Bigfoot sightings and, all of these television shows about it, like In Search Of and all this kind of stuff. There was the book series that, you always saw those ads for, that were going to tell you the mysteries of the world. And we were always kind of looking for these types of answers. So it's very much playing on that kind of pop culture moment that is very kind of in tune with that. And then, television is kind of harping on it. And I think at the same time, it's also very much working on this idea of, you know, Halloween as a new American tradition. Now, Halloween becoming more and more popular as the decades go. Of course, today it's like insanely popular, but you know, for 80s kids growing up, it was very much like to get the, you know, the branded costume, which was the mask with the little jumpsuity thing that was plastic that we would all get. You know, you could be Yoda, you could be Superman, you could be, you know, Spider-Man. Like, these were like the big ones when I was a kid. But it was becoming more and more just kind of part of American society and more popular at that time. So playing on those two things, like our obsession with these bizarre things that we don't understand, like Stonehenge. Why is it there? Who put it there? And, you know, so now we're getting this kind of old world questions of, you know, druids and things like that that we know very like this much of at the time. Pairing it with, you know, Halloween as a holiday for little kids. So one of the things that I really love about this movie is that it holds absolutely no issue with literally attacking children. The people that die, the intent of this master plan is to, like, take out the children. That is so taboo. Not just like, I don't know, 1980s taboo. That's just like major taboo. You don't see stuff like that, you know, on TV shows at the time, definitely. Even in movies. Even today, it's pretty taboo in a mainstream film like this. It's like released by Universal to openly attack children and want to kill them, cause harm. So I think that's another thing about this film that sets it apart from other things that were going on at the time. You know, these aren't teenagers, you know, this isn't a slasher aimed at, you know, horny teens or campers in the woods or colleges, you know, college kids having raging parties. These are little kids that just want candy and to watch a scary movie that night, you know? So that's definitely something about this film that goes someplace untraditional. I guess let's go back a little bit, you know, let's break down some of the behind the scenes some more. So like I said, the director of the film and kind of co-writer, I guess we're going to dub him, Tommy Lee Wallace. As a writer, you know, he first comes on the scene with Amityville 2: The Possession, which that's a film that's got some controversy. We will get into that another time, probably. But also, as a writer-director, he then makes Fright Night 2. And of course, the thing he's probably best known for is the mini-series of the 90s based on It by Stephen King. But also know that he was the editor for the original Halloween and The Fog. So this is how he's kind of part of the family. You know, he's kind of in the mix, the Carpenter Hill world of people who work on their films. So that's a big one. Another person who's definitely part of that family is the director of photography on this film is Dean Cundey. Now, Dean Cundey has worked on over 100 films and like every big movie you can think of pretty much. But just to break it down, just here's some of my favorites, like his hit list right here. Halloween, obviously, Rock and Roll High School, just thought it was fun. The Fog, Escape from New York, The Thing, right? So we got his, right off the bat, he's really banging out a bunch of Carpenters. He did Psycho 2, the Back to the Future trilogy, Big Trouble in Little China, back to Carpenter. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? From a director of photography, that had to be a tough film to make. That deserves an episode someday. And Jurassic Park. That's just my favorites. Like I said, over 100 films. Dean Cundey is kind of known entity, right? And to me, the other big name in the crew department is the music for this film, which is super identifiable, right? Like this is like that jingle that gets stuck in your brain. So this is a collaboration between John Carpenter, who works on, you know, the scores for many of his films, with Alan Howarth. Now, Howarth, I think until recently, I don't think so many of us knew how involved he was and how many pictures. I guess his name is in the credits, but it didn't click to me just how, like, you get the writer, director, producer, editor, score credit from Carpenter, and that kind of gets stuck in your brain. But most of those scores, or I'll say a good chunk of those scores, is working in tandem with Alan Howarth, who's kind of the synth guy, right? They started working together on Escape from New York. Then he goes on to do Halloween 2, They do The Thing, the parts of The Thing that are Carpenter's score. Christine, the Carpenter film, Stephen King based. Big Trouble, Prince of Darkness, They Live. That's just their Carpenter Howarth collabs. But what Howarth is kind of really known for in Hollywood is he's the guy behind a lot of the sound effects on, wow, just like every movie you can think of. I feel like when you look at his list, it's just too massive to even try and break into. But that's really what his background, or what he's kind of like more prolific in, is as a sound effects guy. Which makes sense as a guy who works behind synths. So one thing I have really not talked about yet that is what maybe this movie is most known for is its cast, because the star is Tom Atkins. Now, he's an untraditional star, like leading man, because he is, I'm guessing by this point he might have been in his 40s already. I'll have to look that up, but I will look up how old he was exactly. But he was not, you know, he's not a kid. He's not like a 20 or 30-year-old man. But he, so he's an older guy. He's a professional already, you know. He's, like I said, he's a doctor, but also he is a divorced father who seems to be a bit of a slouch when it comes to his family, which, hey, I guess that's why he's divorced. We'll get into some of the other problematic things about his character in a moment, but Tom Atkins in himself is a bit of a you know, a legend in the horror genre. Of course, we know him from George Romero's films, being kind of the wraparound, playing the dad in the original Creepshow. But also, I mean, with George Romero, he was in Two Evil Eyes and also Bruiser. But with John Carpenter, he does The Fog and Escape from New York before we get to Halloween 3. Of course, he also, that's not only stuff in his credit, but in the genre, of course, he did Night of the Creeps, which is a big one, Maniac Cop, and The Ninth Configuration. So Atkins is, you know, a bit of a staple, right? The daughter of the man who dies in the opening is played by Stacey Nelkin. Mostly a television career, not a lot of other genre work. Like, the closest I'm going to find here is that she did a Twilight Zone episode in the 80s. But, you know, this was, I think, like a breakout role for her as like a leading lady. The kind of the man behind the corporation that is Silver Shamrock, the company making the masks and having the master plan, is played by Dan O'Halloran, who in the 80s, I mean, this film went along with that he was in Last Starfighter and RoboCop. So that's how we know him, I guess. But really, when you look at his catalog, going back all the way into the 50s, he was in Invasion USA 1952, which is like one of those drive-in sci-fi type flicks. He was in the remake in 1962 of Cabinet Dr. Caligari. But really, he did so many like cowboy and swashbucklers and just action films in general. Like I said, from the 50s on, he was kind of a big thing on set. And for Carpenter fans, I do want to point out that Tom Atkins' character's ex-wife is played by Nancy Loomis, who, of course, was in Halloween, The Fog, and Assault on Precinct 13. So, again, part of the family. So that kind of covers the cast and crew. Other things that I wanted to mention about this film. To me, watching it as a teenager, the fact that there's no Michael Myers, to me, was not a big deal. I will say the thing that bothered me more as a horror fan was that it was called Season of the Witch, which, if you recall, is the name of a George Romero film. So I was kind of like, come on, guys, it's already been used, you know? But yeah, as a George Romero fanatic, and as a teenager, I was pretty much already on that path, so yeah, I'm probably a little biased here. But yeah, Season of the Witch, we already used that title in like the 70s, so that always bugged me more. Like I said, the idea was this was supposed to be an anthology series, so really, if this movie had been better received, because like basically it comes out and they use a great tagline. I love the tagline. It's the night no one comes home, because we're playing on the whole the night he came home, the night he came home again, or whatever it was for Halloween 2. But so if it had been better received, and I think maybe if they had made a better effort in making sure the audience knew what they were walking into, right? like maybe it wouldn't have been as big deal. A lot of people now, like on the extras on here, like a lot of the people who worked on the film were kind of like, well, if it hadn't have been for the 3, right? Like if you hadn't put the number there, even if you hadn't even called it Halloween, or maybe Season of the Witch, Halloween, you know, part 3. If you'd reversed that in some way or removed the number at least, perhaps people wouldn't have been as mad. But basically, it goes through this kind of release where nobody cared once they saw it, because they're like, I wanted Michael Myers, I wanted Jamie Lee Curtis. So it had this kind of backlash, and it was perceived by the filmmakers as basically just being a flop, like it tanked. But what really helps this movie is cable TV and video stores. And to some extent, I think DVD had a lot to do with it too when it got reissued. I think that's when people start to rediscover it and have more love for this film and just kind of take it for what it is, as opposed to the, you know, the big kind of hurdle of getting over this kind of initial idea that this was going to be more Michael Myers. And I'll be honest, I was totally fine when I first started watching these films to be like, okay, so it's a trilogy. Halloween with Halloween 2, and then Halloween 3, and unfortunately there wasn't another kind of story in that vein to pull off that anthology vibe. And really, until the more recent, for me, that was kind of it for the Halloweens, and I've seen them all. I mean, I'm not going to say I absolutely hate them, but I do like part 6. But I don't really know how much you need them. And I dug the fact that they were going to do something different, and like switch it up and be like, hey, we're just going to use this title and kind of run with what we can do with that name just for what it means. It's a movie on Halloween night, you know? So I think once we get out of the initial run and it's kind of slowly just kind of put back out there into public kind of background, you know, running on cable, going out to video stores, and people kind of got over it, right? They could just watch the movie, because now you got people who are like, hey, Tom Atkins is in this movie, I'm gonna check this out, you know? And then the kind of, it builds its own kind of rapport. One of the kind of early, and also like, I'm gonna refer back to this Fango issue I was just talking about, because it does talk quite a bit about the anniversary of the film. There's an article in here about Joe Bob Briggs in Halloween 3. Now, he's one of those guys, when the movie came out, it was like, what's this crap, right? He, I think, openly reviewed it like, where's Michael Myers? We want some stabby. So, he's probably one of the kind of bigger names who was out there saying, you know, this isn't what we wanted as fans, right? And I think he's only recently kind of, thanks to, I guess it's Darcy, there's an interview with Darcy talking about getting him to finally watch the movie again. But yeah, I think it's that the people who were maybe the target age when it came out, or the people who were like going to the theater as fans then, don't have the same feel as maybe some of us who were too young, you know, like who come upon it later. Like I said, I was totally, as a teenager, going down the line at the video store with all the movies I needed to see, you know, the checklist we always have, you know. So that's a big kind of difference in where you're kind of coming at it from. But yeah, that's so unfortunate that it took decades, really, for people to come around and be like, no, really, it's a good film. Check it out, you know. Yeah, I mean, another big issue now is that it's got a problematic protagonist, right? And it's hard to not notice it more and more, I think, every time I watch. Okay, I get it. He's divorced, so maybe seeing his ex isn't that important to him. Seeing his kids should be maybe a little more important. I don't know. But it also seems like the women that he works with, he's kind of very flirtatious. You know, he has this kind of on and off again phone thing with the woman who works in pathology, or, you know, working in the morgue, running stuff for him, who it seems like they have a history. He meets this girl who's the daughter of someone who just died, and kind of like overnight they're together, Like, she's gotta be like half his age. That's creepy, dude. Can't not realize how creepy that is. So, I mean, we have a womanizer protagonist. I mean, it's very 80s, but it doesn't flow so well now for some of us. But I think in some way that's just become part of, like, the joke of it. Like, that's it. That's just how that guy is, because he's so, like, that dude, you know, from the 80s, the dad with the stash kind of guy. It's also so strange for me that, like you think of The Fog, like, he ends up in bed with Jamie Lee Curtis pretty damn fast, too. So it's like, what am I missing about Tom Atkins that maybe women in the 80s saw that I do not? Alright, so I couldn't not touch on that one. No pun intended, no interest. Met Tom Atkins a couple times, he's a nice guy. But I never got the kind of, why is he like Mr. Sex Appeal? And end up with all, he always gets the chick in these movies. Weird. But I think that, yeah, his character being kind of this kind of ladies' man is a bit of a joke in the fandom. I mean, we talked about the fact that there's a lot of people from, like, the Carpenter Hill family of filmmakers that show up in this, and I think that's another thing about this movie that's very endearing, and seeing that kind of, I love seeing those crews, which is the other reason why, you know, Romero films have so much for me, is this kind of, you know, the crew becomes a family that moves on to the next film together. So I like this aspect as well of this film. And I think, aside from noting how taboo it is to kind of go after children as your kind of your focus for your violence, I think you also have to note there's some amazing special effects in this film. Because of that, there's the scene where we see the kind of annoying kid that comes with the very ugly American family that are at the factory picking up their masks. And you see the kind of like the test screening on him, and, you know, watching essentially his face melt and the snakes come out. I mean, it's really impressive. Like, holy crap, you know, like that looks great. It still holds up, looks great today. The kind of the animatronic folks and the animatronic guys in this, they do that really pretty decent with some simple effects work to kind of make that work. You know, it's just, the film still holds up visually. I think it looks great. You know, there's a lot of things about it that you could think might not age well, but aside from, like, what I was saying about Tom Atkins, I think the movie ages really well, and I think that's another reason maybe why people kind of gave it another try, is because, you know, I honestly think this film holds up better than Halloween 2 in that fact, where it's not as dated in that way. I mean, yeah, it's obviously 80s cartoon TV, what it was like to be a kid, and there's some great things about, you know, making that jingle that it sounds like a commercial from the 80s, and it's it's interesting also that Deborah Hill was very much very hands-on in some of these aspects of this film, and she's the one who wanted that jingle using like a public domain song. So, you know, you take, just like most kids things were at the time, and kind of mess with it and make it synthy and kind of just go with it. And they end up recording, Howarth records Tommy Lee Wallace saying everything and doing the kind of singing the jingle. He does all the voiceovers as well. Like all the radio announcer type stuff is all Tommy Lee Wallace. But he takes him kind of saying the, you know, 3 more days till Halloween, and he does the old Chipmunks routine of playing it back fast and putting that with the synth, like, or e, you know, that kind of organy music, kind of like organ grinder kind of sounding, but synthy. It really just sounds like ads that, you know, I totally feel like you would have heard back then on TV. So all of that's really cool. Speaking of a lot of those kind of stories, Halloween 3 that the collector's edition I'm looking at here is the Scream Factory, of course. There's a great doc on here, half-hour long, called Standalone. It was a Red Shirt production. You know, I'm always a fan of that stuff. But they talk about the iconic music for it, and you know, like the iconic masks. These are Dan Post masks for 2 of them, and the fact they wanted a third. Tommy Lee Wallace works with Don Post, which is like a famous, you know, mask making company, to make the third mold, and so those were all Don Post masks. So that's like the top quality you used to see in the catalogs, you know, back then. So that was cool to learn about. They talk about the backlash, people who didn't understand it, people who just thought it was just going to die. But one thing that Wallace talks about in his kind of overview that Deborah Hill gives on the project is that she wanted it to be taking kind of witchcraft and bringing it into the computer age. And this is like, thinking computer age, or we're talking like Atari kind of computer. We're talking, you know, like, this is the age of maybe the Commodore 64, you know, maybe an Apple II might be around by now. But, you know, this is when computers did things in dot matrix with green and black. But still, that's kind of a good starting point when you think of it. It's modernizing kind of witchcraft. And that's where you take that kind of like taking Stonehenge and early computers and putting it together. That makes it very much, where I guess, like I said, I guess to me, a lot of this doesn't feel as dated. But I guess, you know, that would be the element of how the computers look. You could easily, you know, I don't want to say we need to remake this film in any way, shape, or form, but that maybe is the only thing that dates it, is what the computers actually are to me. So yeah, I mean, I love this film. So this is a great addition. I love this special edition. It's also got a Halloween horror hallowed ground where they go to the locations. I think it was a paper factory that they shot the film at. They go there, amongst other places also. Great edition. Scream Factories always are. As far as other editions and things that I own, I do have the Universal DVD special edition. I'm trying to see if it's really special or if it's just widescreen. Don't remember if there's anything extra on this one. But it was still a great movie to upgrade from VHS. Who do I have on here? I got Tommy Lee Wallace, Tom Atkins, and Stacey Nelkin. So I have, you know, the power trio on here because I absolutely love this film. So yeah, that's the only real DVD edition that I know that was in any way special. Yeah. And also I did get to meet Alan Hallworth, so this was the score I got, one of the scores I got from him, I should say. It's just iconic. It plays enough, as much as Halloween itself has this iconic score, it plays with it in a synthy way that really kind of, I guess, updates it, but also makes it a period piece in the music, you know, the way the music scores. But this is a pretty cool score. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of all I have on this one, but it's just because it's just a great movie, and if you're one of those people who is like, I don't know, where's Michael Myers? Don't even think about it as Halloween. Just think of it as Season of the Witch and give it a try. If you skipped over it because there was no Michael Myers, go back. Definitely worth it. And you know, like I said, as Halloween ends, has happened, I hope people are going back and revisiting some of the older movies in the series, not just the first one. But don't forget, the original Halloween 3, Before Halloween Ends, was Season of the Witch. Well, that's it for me this time. I'll see you guys next time with hopefully a special holiday edition